Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Adrian's Digital Basement. Yes, if you can believe it, what you see here on the bench is the TRS-80 Model II, which I revived from basically left out in the trash on a whole bunch of videos back at the end of last year, all the way into, I think, January of 2022. Let me just do a little bit of a recap really quick in case you don't quite remember all of those video series. But of course, I'll have links in the description below so you can go watch those all. In fact, I myself had to watch some of those just to refresh my own memory on what I did on this machine, because it's been quite a while and I've worked on a lot of machines since. So when I found this machine, it was given to me, it was rescue, it had the top off for a long time. Inside was tons of debris like leaves and bugs and stuff like that. So I slowly took this thing apart, which was interesting figuring out how to do that because there was a lot of rust and stuff. And I slowly tested each of the parts, like the CRT and the analog board for it, then the power supply, then the disk drive here. I hooked it up to a PC and accessed it in DOS. And then finally we got to all the cards, and I have one right here. This is the floppy drive controller. A lot of these had bad corrosion on them just because of all the moisture that had gotten into this machine over the years. Well, in that last video, I thought I had this machine all back together. It's basically how it was looking right here, looking cosmetically pretty good, and it seemed to be operating normally as well. But after hooking up a GoTech drive and booting into the TRS-80 Model II diagnostic disc, this is an official disk image from Radio Shack, I ran through the diagnostics, and then on the reboot, the computer stopped really working properly. So in this video, I'm going to try to figure out what exactly is going wrong with this machine and see if I can get it working. Now, I'm recording this intro in August of 2022, when of course this machine's been sitting for quite a while. And that's really because I had a problem with my right shoulder, which prevented me from really lifting incredibly heavy machines like this. So this computer sat on the back burner for a while. I also recently released a video on the second channel where I showed a diagnostic ROM that me and my friend David and Frank came up with for this machine. Originally, yes, it's the same diagnostic ROM for the Model I and III, but we ported it to run on the Model II. Architecturally, it's similar, but not really. It's just a Z80 processor like the other machines, but this thing supports up to 512K of memory. The video controller is totally different. It uses a CRT-C, stuff like that. So there are quite a number of differences, but David did the majority of the work and got that diagnostic ROM running. So I recommend you check out that video on the second channel first if you haven't seen it, because I'm going to be using that diagnostic ROM in this machine, in this video, to try to figure out what's wrong. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention before we finally get started with this video, and it's that most of the troubleshooting that you're going to see around the keyboard problem and stuff like that was all done back in, I think, December of last year, 2021, when I was actually doing all that, the bulk of the work on this machine. The problem is my shoulder thing crept up, so I decided to not finish that video and not release it either and just shelve this machine temporarily. So first off, we're going to start with me showing the problem with this machine just as a refresher. That will be from the last video, part 8, and then I will jump into the troubleshooting. And I hope, and it's not done yet, but I hope to get this machine working once again because it's so cool and I want to at least play around with it. I felt a little ripped off after all that work I did on all those 8 previous parts to never actually really play around with this computer at all because it just started misbehaving so quickly. So anyhow, without further ado, let's get right to it. Now, while we wait for this to boot, people had mentioned that I needed to make sure I take this disk out of the drive, or at least open it. Look at that, it's not working still. All right, so this one is working fine. Whoa. Wait a second, what's going on here? No, it's not working fine. Well, this is very strange. Keyboard is having all sorts of issues Like some of the keys give you the right key, but like 8 gives me a 9, 9 gives me a 9, 7 gives me a 7, 6 gives me a 6. It's like one of the bits is bad or something. Let's try a reset again. And look, it just hung here booting up, and this is off the original disk now. What's happening with this machine? Oh, okay. Okay, and it's acting very strange in a different way. All right, I'm turning the computer off. I'm gonna go inside the machine and I'm going to manipulate the cables. I'm just checking all the connections, kind of wiggling the cards in the slots. Maybe there's just a bad contact or something. It's definitely kind of weird that things were working fine, not to mention I had the GoTech connected as it is right now yesterday, and I was doing testing and stuff with the diagnostic disc, and I didn't have any problems whatsoever. Okay, it came up here all right, but the keyboard is still having issues. It types perfectly, but instead of a D, I get the E, for instance, and I get E for E, and that doesn't work. For F, I get a G, H is an I. I have never had a diagnostic routine actually cause damage. Now, I don't really feel that that happened here. It's just coincidence that something failed in the keyboard at the same time, but pretty unusual that it happened all of a sudden just like that. All right, I'm over here in the technical manual for the machine. I've pretty much concluded this cannot be a problem with the keyboard. This is a problem in the computer itself. Okay, we look at the keyboard layout here. These are the codes that it sends. So over here on the number pad, 1 is 31, 2 is 32, and same thing over here. So that's 31, 32. I think this is like shift and control, like sends different codes, but this is the regular code. So when I push 1, I got a 1. But when I push 2, I got a 3. And pushing 3, I also got a 3. Now I had that problem with the 1, 2, and 3 for both the number keypad and these keys here. So this was key number 2, 3, and 4, where key number 3 was having an issue. Now this issue was happening all over the keyboard, but if we look at 3, and I was also having a problem over here on key 56, it's hard to read that. So there's key number 56, and there is key number 3. They're not even on the same lines at all on the matrix. I really don't think this is a problem with the keyboard. This has to be a problem with the card in the computer that receives the signals from the keyboard. Now it's the video board that handles the keyboard. Now one thing I'm kind of interested about is it's 24 by 80 lines normally, but it also has a 40 column mode as well. It's kind of interesting. But here is the block diagram of that card. So here's the address, control, and data bus on the main backplane. This stuff is all for video right here, but right here is keyboard control, and there is the keyboard itself communicating to that controller chip through these lines. Now I'm hoping that this keyboard control on the PCB, even though it's just one square here, has some normal chips on it, and it's not some kind of custom microprocessor that might have failed, because then we're in trouble. On this page, it shows the signaling that happens between the keyboard and the computer. So data and clock comes from the keyboard, and there is a busy signal. So this is very typical for the way keyboards work on all PCs. So I have two tabs open so I can jump between. So okay, so the data comes in, it goes to this IC here, which is an LS74, okay. And it really just goes through a couple of these ICs here. I wouldn't be surprised if the LS244 is, let's see, is this the data bus? Yeah, this is the data bus. All right, so it's connected right to the data bus. So right away, I am suspecting that this IC right here, this LS164, is the problem. And indeed, this is a parallel out shift register. So it takes that signal that's coming from the keyboard, which is probably just ASCII, like you push 3 and it sends a 3, and this just converts that serial 3, which is a string of bits with a clock signal, into a parallel 3, the ASCII representation of it. Now if we look in this column here and we look at the difference between 2 and 3, the only difference is this single bit right there, that first bit, so that's bit 0 on the data bus, is the only thing that's wrong. So when I push 2, I get a 3, which implies that that bit right there is stuck high. Now, the reason why I'm pretty sure that the problem is with data bit 0 that comes out of this chip, this LS164, is because if on the data bus of the whole computer, or at least of the video card, if data bit 0 were stuck at 1 all the time, we would have a non-functional video card. The 6845, which is a CRTC controller, wouldn't be initializing properly. There would be other issues. But the problem is strictly related to the keyboard, which means it either has to be this shift register. It's possible this LS244 is bad, the side of it that faces the shift register. Unfortunately, it could also be the keyboard. Now, I ruled out the matrix on the keyboard is not the problem because the symptom we're seeing is of a stuck data bit. But it looks like it uses an 8021 microprocessor in the keyboard to translate the matrix into the serial signal that goes to the computer. So, and unfortunately for me, Z4 here is the microprocessor, and it generates the serial signal directly that goes out to the computer. So here's the data and the clock signal. So if this chip has gone bad, that keyboard unfortunately is toast. There'll be no way to replace this chip. So I really, really hope that the problem lies here on the video card. I really hope, oh boy. All right, so here is the video board out of the computer, and that's the 244 that might be the problem, and that is the shift register, parallel shift register. I have the power supply connected. I'm gonna feed this 5 volts. I have the oscilloscope probe ready. I unfortunately can't connect the keyboard because I don't have the right cable, and it's all integrated into the machine. Otherwise, I could just connect the keyboard up and we could actually type on it and look at the signals coming through on here. But let me power up this board. All right, we're getting a nice 5 volts there on that chip, which is as expected. Okay, here we are on the LS244, pin 12. That's data bus 0, it's a bit hard to see. But pin 8 and 13 on the 164 are the 2 pins we want to look at. You know, now that I think about it, it's quite possible. Let me just do the old temperature check on these. No, they're not hot. It is quite possible that this has garbage as its default state. So it has an asynchronous clear, which is pin 9, and it has a line over it, which means that it clears the chip when it's low. Okay, and that signal is high right now, so that chip might just be showing garbage. I need to clear it. Okay, and pin 9 is connected to the U17 LS74 and pulled up to 5 volts. A quick check to the 74 LS74 data sheet. And it's pin 1, which is actually the clear pin for this IC as well. And you notice it's an input here. Clear is an input. And it's pulled high, so this chip is functioning, right? It's working. So that means I can pull pin 9 safely down to ground, which will reset both of these chips. And hopefully the LS164 will output all zeros at that point. Oh, incidentally, if you're wondering how the data from the LS174 makes its way to the data bus, there are a couple lines here on the LS244 right here, FCRD, which would be something like keyboard read, I guess. I don't know what FC stands for. But when these go low, I think, that means that the 244 connects these lines to the data bus, and then the computer can actually read the keyboard. But while those are not enabled, these signals here don't actually make their way past the LS244. So I've gone ahead and I've hooked the oscilloscope up to pin 13, which is right here. I think that's the pin we're trying to look at. And let me turn the power back on. Okay, it went back to 4 volts. And I'm gonna take this little jumper lead and I'm gonna ground it to the ground pin, pin 9 that is, and let's see what happens. Ah, it went low. Well, that's problematic because that would imply that this chip is working. Oh no! No, 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 no. Let me go through all the pins on here. They should all be low at this point. So that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 is low, 11, 12, and 13. Uh-oh, spaghetti-o. This is not good here. It is still technically possible that when this does the shifting function, that it has a problem. Like resets it without an issue, but the shifting out doesn't work properly. All right, so since I cannot connect the keyboard and test on the bench here, I am going to pull these out, both the 244 and the 164. We'll test them in the retro chip tester, and let's hope that one of these 2 chips is bad. All right, we have the Retro Chip Tester Pro. I've taken out the 164. I left the 244 in there. I figured I'll just test one at a time. So in with this, see what happens. Oh no, that is working. This is bad news, everyone. Really bad news. All right, so that chip's fine. I'm gonna pull out this 244 next. Okay, the 244 is out, and I also installed 2 sockets in there while I was at it. It's the moment of truth. Let's stick that into the chip tester. Oh no, that's a good chip as well. So that's really disheartening. I'm just gonna reinstall this back into the board. That's disheartening because, I mean, further testing is gonna be needed, but I have a feeling it may well be the controller inside the keyboard that's given up the ghost. A bad shift register here would have been super easy to fix because that's a very common part. All right, so the chips both test good in the Retro Chip Tester Pro. I'm gonna stick this back in the computer like this, see if there's any change, and then just for grins, I'm gonna swap out these 2 chips. Maybe there's a problem with the driver on the 244 that is not detected by the Retro Chip Tester Pro because it's not in circuit, and let's see if that's a problem. It's technically possible that something else on the data bus after the 244, like the CRT C controller, is sort of holding the line high, and maybe there's a problem with the driver where it's not able to pull it down to ground so that the transceivers, which are these chips, see it as a 1. I mean, it could be something like that, who knows? Okay, with the keyboard connected, it did boot back up to the diagnostic disc, the one that wasn't working. So let's see if these keys work. 1, 2 is working. 3, it's fixed itself. This is not good. I hate these types of problems. What is quite possible is that those ICs were problematic, and the act of removing them from the board, and I used hot air to get them off the PCB after I used the Hakko just to make sure I didn't lift any traces, that does heat up the chip. Maybe there's something extremely marginal happening inside of there and the heat actually fixed it. Well, that is very frustrating and disappointing all at the same time, because I kind of expected to be able to find that fault and get it working, and instead the computer fixed itself for no apparent reason. Okay, the saga actually continues because I had recorded an outro to this video and everything, and then after that, I turned the computer on and it's not working again. Let's see if it's still broken. Hopefully it hasn't fixed itself in the few minutes it's been off since I recorded the outro. So I am booting the diagnostic disc again, and remember this was the one that was just freezing. If this does freeze all the same, I'm gonna put the other disc in where it gives us the time prompt. Okay, yep, frozen exactly the same way. So let's reset the machine. Oops, I meant to reset it, but I turned it off. In with the other boot disk, the one that was at least letting us type. So if the keyboard problem is the same, I have replacement 244 and 164 shift register here. So we will see if those fix the problem. Okay, and yep, right away, it's over here where it shouldn't be. 1, and that not only hits it hits a tab, and then puts the 3 over there. Let's see, 3, 3, 5, yeah, okay, it's exactly the same problem. So the 2 key gives us a 3, and the 4 key gives us a 5, and the 6 should give us a 7, and it does. 8 should give us 9, yeah, okay. So identical issue. It looks like that data bit 0 is frozen again. Look at this, it's not even booting at all now. What is happening? All right, weird, it's getting worse. Now this is where having spare cards would certainly help the situation, because I could take out this video board, for instance, and put in another known good one, see if that changes anything. In the meantime, I'm just gonna swap these 2 chips over. Okay, so I just swapped over the 244 because that booting problem, I'm not sure if the 164 could cause that issue, because when you're not pushing a key, it shouldn't be trying to read anything from the keyboard. All right, here we go. See what happens. At least it's starting to boot. That didn't seem to make any difference at all. The drive is still enabled, but it unloaded the head, so it's not even trying to boot anymore. Incidentally, the GoTech is not even connected at all. So in case anyone thinks that that's somehow causing a problem, it's unrelated to what's going on here. All right, just for grins, I swapped over the 164 to that extra chip I had. See if that makes any difference. I don't think that's gonna make any difference whatsoever. Nope, exactly the same. So this problem is completely unrelated to the keyboard. That was somehow one of the symptoms, which is very, very confusing to me. The weird thing is this computer does work to some extent. Obviously, it's initializing the video, we're getting some text, it's able to read that the disk is in there or not in there, but now it can't boot. What I did is I swapped the bus transceivers on the video card. So this is what connects the data bus. I swapped two of them around. I looked up which one is data bus 0 or data bit 0, the one we were having a problem with, and I swapped that with the one next to it. Okay, that was weird. It actually is different in that it seems like it just rebooted itself, sort of. Okay. It says error 32, error 25, error 25, error 7. So this computer is it's a very unhappy machine. Look at that. Boot error RS. Okay, I was about to record the outro, but I have one more thing that I want to try. I'm gonna remove the LS244 for the keyboard from that board altogether. That should effectively disable the whole keyboard circuit, but the rest of the video card should be working. If mysteriously everything just starts working perfectly, then I think that might give us a clue to what's going on. There's something going on with the chip select logic for the keyboard section of this machine. And I just removed the LS244 altogether, which means that that chip has no possibility to erroneously drive the bus. Although that has me thinking that that shouldn't matter because there's a second set of bus transceivers between the video keyboard card and the rest of this machine. Okay, so that made no difference. It just stopped in exactly the same way. So clearly something else is wrong. Alrighty, we are now back in August 2022. And as you just saw, I was not able to really figure out what the problem was. The two chips that I assumed were the issue on the video card for the keyboard were not actually a problem at all. And that's really where I left off with this machine. Now, if you watch that second channel video, and I think if I turn this on, we should see the Diagnostic Rom running. I still have it installed in the CPU card. The diagnostic routines appear to be working properly on this machine. So the question is, if I try to boot this machine into DOS, or the TRS DOS that is, are we still gonna have that keyboard issue that I was experiencing before? Remember that when I first had this computer back together at basically the beginning of the last video, this thing was working properly. I was booting software and I had used it quite a bit, and then it started acting up. Now, in all the troubleshooting where I was taking cards out and swapping chips and stuff like that, that was actually over a number of days, and the computer never started working again. So it wasn't exactly like a heat issue, which you might think it would be, where, say, after cooling off for a few hours, the computer would work properly. That was simply not the case. It was days and days and days had gone by, and this computer never started working again. Now, of course, I put this off to the side and it's been like 8 or 9 months since, and maybe now it's actually working. Now, here's the funny thing. While I was making the videos for this Diagnostic Rom, after I had completed the video, the computer started acting up while running this actual diagnostic. Now, the reason why you might have noticed when I turned this on, it didn't click the floppy drive is because the floppy controller is out of the machine. And I say that because I think the problem that might have been happening the whole time is actually due to the floppy controller. And here's why. Now, the video you're watching now is the diagnostic running on this machine. I had recorded it on my phone because I was done shooting the main video, and it was running through the diagnostics. And as it was going through all the different banks on the screen, the floppy drive light was flashing on and off. That absolutely should not happen. There is no circumstance when that would happen. In addition, sometimes when I would turn on the computer, it actually would just hang at the original memory test. Well, I talked to David, of course, who wrote most of these enhanced routines for this ROM for this machine. Well, it turns out that basically what happens is when you first turn the computer on, it actually issues a command to the disk drive controller, well, I'm pointing at the disk drive, but to the controller, and it waits for that command to return a bit that says, okay, I'm done. Well, what happens is if it doesn't get that right response, it just sits there permanently, indefinitely, basically, at that sort of screen that shows all the characters on the full screen, that is. Well, that's what this machine started doing. Now, it was kind of random though, like sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't. It was doing very similar things to last time where I was trying to boot the operating system and it just wasn't working. Well, I found that when I took out the disk drive controller, everything would work totally normally again. Nothing weird would happen on this machine. Oh, there's one other little tidbit. Sometimes while it was running with this controller in there, when it was acting up and the light was flashing and stuff where it shouldn't have been flashing, occasionally the computer would crash. It would reboot. It would just do really weird things. And again, when I pulled the controller out, everything went away. So the diagnostic ROMs really did help me figure out that it probably is the disk controller. And earlier in this video, I was thinking that it was the keyboard controller on the video card. So what's kind of cool is this really gives me a place to start. And the stock diagnostic ROM, or the stock ROM on this thing, is so primitive that it really gave me no indication what might be going on. And because you can't just turn this computer on without the disk controller and have it do anything, I couldn't really test properly. And I guess what happened is while I recorded the video for the diagnostic ROM, I had this machine on for a number of hours. And just like last time, after a number of hours, it started misbehaving. Now, it's been a couple days since I shot that video on my phone with the computer screwing up. Let's put this card back in this machine, and I want to see, does it start misbehaving like last time? Okay, the disk controller is back in the machine, so when I turn this on, if all is working well, we should hear this click 3 times with the light flashing 3 times, and then everything should be working normally. Let's see what happens. Okay, well, right away it's not doing anything, and there it is. It's just frozen at the screen here. So the diagnostic ROM issues a command to the disk drive to, I think, like select the drive and activate the heads or whatever, and now it's waiting for a bit to be set to 0. Look at that, it actually passed that screen. All right, so, oh, okay, it's doing it. So here it is, it's still doing it. So this is days later. Okay, I don't know, did it once. There it goes. This should not be happening. Now the thing is, as I mentioned, it's selecting the different banks of RAM right now. It's trying to as it goes through there. And this is obviously selecting here the floppy drive when it shouldn't be. So yeah, I'm gonna say that absolutely for sure the fault that I was getting, you know, months and months ago is happening again on this thing. And it all seems to point to that disk drive. This diagnostic ROM was super useful at figuring that out. If the stock ROM had like a basic prompt that if I turned it on, it could go into basic if I didn't have the disk drive, I might be able to issue some commands to see if there was a problem. In fact, I could have just taken out the disk drive controller, and then if the keyboard suddenly started working and I put the controller back in and then I couldn't type anymore, well, right there, I'd know that it was a floppy card. But you can't do that. So this ROM that I came up with, just like on the Model 3, that was incredibly useful. Like, we have some information now on what might be wrong, because honestly, after I found out that those keyboard decoder chips were good, I was completely lost as to what might be wrong with this computer, and I pretty much figured I'd need to grab cards out of another Model II and substitute them in here to see if that fixed the problem. All right, there it is. The floppy drive controller seems to be causing all our issues. And actually, something interesting, I tried the original ROM back in this machine. This is actually the diagnostic ROM. I incidentally transferred it onto a 2716. I put the stock ROM back in. The computer doesn't even boot at all. Before, as you saw earlier in the video, it was actually trying to load the operating system, and we had those weird issues with the keyboard and stuff like that. Now it's just attempting to boot the disk. It like loads the heads. I hear clicking and stuff. Never actually loads anything at all. There's one little extra tidbit of information I want to add. After recording that footage that you saw earlier in this video where I kind of gave up for a while at least before my shoulder went bad, I actually did a whole bunch more troubleshooting on this disk drive controller, trying to figure out if any of the ICs were bad on it. And because of that, we have a couple extra socketed ICs, like this one here is socketed where it didn't used to be. And I think that was part of that troubleshooting that I was doing with this controller. I never actually got anywhere, and I kind of felt very defeated and was totally stumped with the problem that this was having, especially because there was just no easy way to do testing outside of booting an operating system. And since that wasn't working and it was acting all weird, I basically just had no idea where to go. So the Diagnostic Rom here, with that clicking of the heads as it did the bank switching, really gave me an amazing clue that really pointed to the disk drive controller as being the fault. So armed with the knowledge that the Diagnostic Rom gave us, let's jump into the schematics for this card and try to figure out what might be going wrong that would actually explain that behavior we were seeing with this Diagnostic Rom. Here we are in the service manual, and this is the schematic here for the disk drive controller. In fact, right here is a floppy drive controller chip, the FD1791. So initially, I was thinking that maybe this disk drive controller chip, which is kind of a rare and expensive chip, I mean, it's not super expensive, but it's not like a $1 chip either. I thought that this chip might be bad. But I was sort of chatting with David about how the bank switching works, the RAM bank switching that is, that seems to be triggering the head on and off. And he indicated to me that it's not actually the floppy drive controller chip that selects the heads on this disk drive. If we zoom out here on the schematics, it's actually this IC right here, which is a 74LS174. Now, unfortunately, the quality of the scan of this service manual is not great, so you can't really read these very easily. But there's the drive select pins output here, SD select, and an FM/MFM pin here that comes out of this thing. It turns out that it's actually this chip that turns on the LED and activates the read-write head on the disk drive. It's not the floppy drive controller at all. But I don't think that there's a problem with this chip specifically. I think the problem lies in the circuitry that turns this chip on. And if we look at this here, this chip is actually connected directly to the data bus. And I think what happens is when you write to the appropriate I/O port on the Z80, what it does is it activates this chip, and whatever's on the data bus, which is these pins right here, 0 through 7, get mirrored into the actual outputs here, which go to the floppy drive. So that's how you could do the drive selects, for instance. Now, the way this chip gets turned on is this pin 9 right here. This is the input, and it's the drive SLT pin or whatever. Well, it's really hard to read what this is coming from, but we can just look for the drive SLT and find that part of the circuitry. And if we scroll up to this part of the schematic, I think we're gonna find it right there. There it is, drive SLT. And this gate has a couple inputs into it. It has one input here from the write I/O pin, so that gets asserted when the processor is trying to write to an I/O port. It has this pin right here, I/O CY/CI. This also comes from the processor and has to do with writing and reading to I/O ports as well. So that, as you see, goes into this gate, it goes into here, and that generates drive select. But there's also one other signal that comes into here, and it's this trace right here. If we follow this along, it comes up here. It is connected to the address lines A0 through A7. And right there, those 8 address lines coincide with the fact that there are exactly 256 I/O address ports that are available on the Z80 that you can write to. So the way it would work is your code says write to I/O port, say 00, and the CPU asserts that line that says, hey, I'm writing to I/O port 00, and it also sets the address bus up for 00. And then what the select logic is supposed to do, which is what we're looking at here, is it's supposed to turn on the chip select line, which is usually driving it low, to whatever chip is going to be connecting to the bus to read the data bus out. So whatever information the CPU writes to the data bus gets read in by that chip. My hypothesis here is that the chip select logic here on the disk drive controller that reads A0 through A7 is actually activating erroneously, possibly all the time, or maybe the output is like somewhere floating or at a weird non-standard voltage where some chips actually get activated when they shouldn't, at the wrong time. And remember that drive select line right here is generated by gating it between this select logic up at the top and this IO write stuff. So if this section up here is misbehaving, it won't be turned on all the time. It will only be turned on when there's also an IO write that's happening on the system. So as the Diagnostic Rom goes through and bank switches all the memory, it's writing to an IO register to tell that part of the RAM card to select in and out those particular banks of memory. Even though they don't exist, it's still writing to an IO port. Well, it seems like that write to the IO port's also activating the disk drive controller there, which is causing that chip to read the data bus when it shouldn't, which is almost certainly why the disk drive gets turned on and off as the banks get selected, because of course it's going through a bunch of different bits as it selects the banks, and the disk drive controller, that particular IC, is seeing the data bus when it shouldn't be, and is turning the disk drive on and off. Because that IC is also turning on the drive select for the other 3 drives that aren't actually physically connected to the computer, then I feel that if those drives were connected, we would actually see the LED coming on each of the drives consecutively, like on, off, basically as it goes through the bank switching. Now let's think about the other problems that's happening. Remember, when you type on the keyboard, you're getting weird results. I think what's happening with that is a bus conflict with the floppy drive controller, because the read signal, which is coming in here, is decoded and mixed together with output from this address select stuff up at the top here. And then that is going to the floppy drive controller chip, which is down here, which has a couple signals on it. It has an in signal and an out signal, which I think are basically connected to the IO port read and write signals from the CPU. And then it has a CE, or a chip enable signal, which is this signal right here, CEFDC, which should be coming from up here, and there it is right there, CEFDC, and you notice here it's generated by this set of gates up there as well. So that implies that during read operations, the floppy drive controller is probably writing to the data bus at the same time as the keyboard part of the circuitry, which probably is crashing bits together as a bus conflict, which is resulting in those weird key presses. Now you might be asking, the system did kind of boot, but then it would crash. Like, what was going on there? You weren't typing any keys or anything. Well, that's probably because as the system boots, it writes to other IO ports for the PIO and the SIO chips. And that is probably causing a conflict with the floppy drive controller chip as the system boots. So as it goes to like set or read the time, it might cause a crash, or who knows, because the floppy drive controller chip might get out of sorts. Now, at this point, it seems like the system is not working at all. And I think that's because the chip enable line to the floppy drive controller is probably just on all the time. And that is causing issues as well. And if the signal is sort of in the middle between 5 and 0 volts, it might be dropping, getting closer to 0 volts, kind of like the PLA failure on the C64, where yeah, the chip is just being selected all the time, as opposed to being selected sometimes. So finally, I think it's time to do some testing. And of course, I can't easily test in the machine, well, at least not right now because it's behind me there, but let's do a little bit of bench testing with this particular card. So if you remember in the past, I did some testing with cards on the bench where I just powered them up with 5 volts directly from my bench power supply across, I don't know, one of the capacitors here. We'll figure out which that is in a second. I'm actually going to remove the floppy drive controller chip because I don't want to be powering up this potentially sensitive IC when there's no signals going to it, and we don't really need to have this in there for testing of the chip select line anyways. All right, I have a feeling it's probably this capacitor right here that is connected to these ICs directly. So this one's labeled plus on that side. Let's just see right here. Yep, 0.21. And right here, we'll go to ground, which is this pin. And yep, that's also continuity. Okay, so this is U8. I'm on the 5 volt pin, looking good. We're getting 4.93, that's completely acceptable. All right, I am currently on U8 pin 11, which is this output right here, and it's currently low, which is unusual, but we can't right away assume this is bad without taking a look at the inputs. So there is pin 12, and it's currently high, it's 4.2 volts. And there is pin 13, and it is also currently high. Let's go take a look at the data sheet and see what the output should be when the 2 inputs are high. And we can see here, it's a 74LS32, and that's confirmed, that's exactly what's on there. And here it is, 74LS32 quad 2 input OR gate. And we were looking at the output on pin 11, and 13 and 12 were the 2 inputs. And we take a look right here, when inputs A and B are both high, the output should also be high. Let's go back to the oscilloscope and double check that that's exactly what I'm seeing. So we're on U8 pin 13, that is definitely high. We are on U8 pin 12, that is definitely high. And we are on U8 pin 11 here, and that is definitely low. So this chip, this does not appear to be working properly. I'll take this chip out and test it in the Retro Chip Tester Pro, but I mean, we can see right here it's violating its own truth table. In fact, we could probably check the other pins on here, but you know what? No point, we know this gate is bad. Now let's think logically about what's going on. The output of U8 should only be low when the address lines match the correct address to actually select that particular I/O port. But it's always low, and it's going into another OR gate, which means a low and another low coming from like a write signal from the CPU means it's going to select that chip. So right there, that confirms for sure U8 is bad. That completely describes the symptoms of what's going on with this thing. It's going to be selecting probably the floppy drive controller as well, and that IC that connects the drive select pins when it shouldn't, when any other thing on the computer writes to one of those I/O addresses. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna remove that chip, which is gonna be a bit of a pain due to that corrosion, and let's see if that fixes things. All right, the chip is out. It's a bit of a pain when there's a lot of corrosion on the solder. It's just really difficult to remove it from the board, but no traces were lifted. This should be no problem. I have a right mind to just remove these chips as well. They look, especially this one, it's all green and crusty on the pins here. So I should probably just take that out along with these two. But you know what? Let's just see what happens with that one. And one thing I want to say before I hit the button to test this is that removing it with heat might have fixed it, because obviously this was like a subtle failure, because remember, the system was working perfectly and then it slowly got worse and worse. So I have a feeling this chip is marginal and the heat might have fixed it. So let's just see. Okay, right away it failed. So, so this chip is definitely 100% definitely bad. And now I have the fun task of looking through my chips to try to find a replacement LS32. And by fun, I mean completely not fun, because I don't have a good way to organize my chips right now. They're just on these sheets here, and yeah, it's tedious. All right, well, that was actually relatively fast. I found a 74S32, and the legs are all mangled here, so I'll try to fix this. I don't know what the difference between S and LS is, but I know I tested this in the Retro Chip Tester Pro, and it does test okay there. Whether this is gonna work in this system or not, well, you know, I don't know, because maybe it's too fast, too slow, one of those things. All right, there we go, just like that. That chip is in there. So let's put the floppy drive controller chip back in here. And I suppose, why don't we go for broke? And I'll just test this in the machine and see if it boots. I mean, could be this one IC the whole time was causing problems, but like I said, all that corrosion on here, or could be these other ones as well. All right, let's test. All right, here we go. I have a disk in here. I don't know if it's actually a boot disk or not, but everything is connected. It's got the stock ROM back in here. Let's turn this on. All right, it's trying to boot. All right, this disk may not be, oh, it's freaking booting. Oh man, I can't believe it. It's freaking working. What? Okay, I was like, oh, look at that. Look at that. Let me grab the keyboard. All right, that looks better in the camera there. Okay, here is the keyboard for it. And thank you very much to the lovely viewer who sent in a new case for this keyboard. So yeah, same keys and everything that I restored last time, so all new foam and foil. But this keyboard case does not have a giant hole in the bottom here. It actually mounts the keyboard connector properly. So we'll turn that off and we'll balance the keyboard right there, just like that. And let's power this on again. I cannot believe that chip. You know, what's really cool to me is as I mentioned, was totally stumped on what was wrong with this thing originally. And then basically The diagnostic ROM gave me the clues that I needed to figure out that it was particularly that select logic that was selecting IO ports when it shouldn't. But okay, so it's booted up. There is the DOS prompt or whatever. The real test here is when I type on the keyboard, am I gonna get the correct letters and stuff? So 1, 2, 3, yep. That is freaking it. I can't believe it. Oh, wow, I am ecstatic here. So there it is. There is the culprit chip, the 74LS32, the one chip that was bad on this machine. I can't remember if any other chips were actually bad on here, but this one was, and it degraded and caused this machine to not work. I have to say, for me, this is a real triumph of the diagnostic ROM once again, because for me, the stock ROM on here just gave no clues as to what was actually the problem. Because you can't remove the floppy drive controller and have the system work at all, the stock ROM just basically errors out immediately when the controller is missing. There's just no way to validate the operation of the machine. On the other hand, the diagnostic ROM does work when the disk drive controller is removed from the system, and we very clearly saw that with the controller in there, well, it wasn't working, and with the controller out, it was. So, I mean, that was the clue right there. And then, of course, the other extra clue was the way the drive was selecting as the bank switching was happening on there, which totally gave us the clues we needed to figure out that it was the chip select on the address lines that was causing the issue. And that, of course, brought me to this friggin' little chip here, which, yeah, was the problem. So yeah, wow, what a journey. And I have to say, when I was first doing troubleshooting on this machine, when I wasn't recording it with the camera too, I spent so many hours trying to just wrap my brain around what could be the problem. And I was just going down wrong paths. Remember the keyboard, I thought the keyboard was wrong. There were red herrings. There were things tricking me, and I needed that diagnostic ROM to work. So the other TRS-80 models do have a basic interpreter, which would allow you to do some simple testing with like IO ports and stuff. That, of course, is if the memory is working, because we know on those systems, when the RAM is bad, it won't even go into basic. You just get that garbage screen, as you saw on the Model 3 ROM. Anyhow, this is a very long video, and but I am so happy, so happy to have been able to fix this thing and do it without having to swap cards around from another working system. That certainly would have given me the indication I needed to know that it was the floppy drive card that was bad, but even with that, it wouldn't have given me the indication to know that it was this chip that was bad, and I would have had to go down the path of taking all the chips out one by one, or I have this, which was sent in by Seth, and this would allow me, you put this in the back of the computer like that into the card cage, and then you can plug cards into the top here and they will run outside of the machine. So at least you can probe the test points and stuff while the machine is powered up and running. This might have been the trick I needed to figure out that this particular chip was bad. In fact, I think there were some test points right on the board for these chip select signals. So I probably could have looked at those while the system was operating with a little logic analysis of the schematic, figured out that that was the problem. So anyhow, if you liked this video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, but if you didn't, you know what to do. I would like to thank a lot of people with this video. Thank you to the original person who gave me this machine, who rescued it. That was a huge thanks. And then of course, thanks to Seth for sending in this. But big thanks to David and Frank for helping with that diagnostic ROM, especially David. He ported the Model 3 ROM over to the Model 2. He did that himself, basically. So huge thank you for that. And I'm really hoping that these diagnostic ROMs that exist now for the Model 1, 2, and 3 will prove useful to others who are working on these machines, give you some tips on how to get them working. As a side note, we're looking to port to the Model 4 and the 4P because I have another one of those machines to work on, although I don't even know if it needs the diagnostic ROM. I haven't tested it yet, but just so that's out there, and that should complete the majority of these machines. I would like to ask if other people have the other models of this machine from the family, like the 16, 16B, 12, and the 6000, if you could test out the diagnostic ROM on your machines, just to let us know if it actually works or not. We can update the documentation on the GitHub repo to reflect that. So anyhow, I think that's gonna be that. Comment down below. Thanks to my patrons, a huge thanks to their support. Their names are scrolling up the side of the screen. If you become a patron, there's early access to videos and other behind the scenes stuff on the channel, things like that. So, okay, whew, that is gonna be that. So stay healthy, stay safe. I will see you next time.